The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut with a dull thud, cutting off the noise of the busy hallway outside. Inside, the room was filled with the low hum of whispers and the shuffling of papers. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the air inside felt thick and warm. Even though the air conditioning was humming quietly in the background, at the front of the room, sitting high above everyone else in a large leather chair, was Judge Holloway. He was a man who took his job very seriously, perhaps too seriously. He was known for being strict and for having very little patience for people who wasted his time. He tapped his pen against the desk, looking at the clock on the wall, clearly wanting to be somewhere else. On this particular day, the courtroom was filled with lawyers in sharp suits carrying expensive briefcases. They walked back and forth, looking important and busy. They were there to argue about a piece of land in the middle of the city. A big company wanted to tear down an old building to put up a new parking lot, but a small group of people were fighting to keep the building standing because they said it was important history. The lawyers for the big company were confident. They laughed and joked with each other, sure that they were going to win easily. The judge had already ruled in their favor on smaller issues in the past, and they expected him to do the same today. The clerk called out the next case. And the main lawyer for the big company, a young man named Mr. Vance, stood up. He smoothed his tie and walked to the center of the room. He looked sharp, with a bright smile and perfectly styled hair. He began to speak using big words and complicated legal terms to explain why the old building should be destroyed. He spoke fast, trying to confuse everyone with how smart he sounded. Judge Holloway nodded along, looking bored but agreeing with everything the young lawyer said. It seemed like just another normal day in court where the people with the most money and the fanciest suits won the game. But then, the atmosphere in the room changed slightly. From the very back of the courtroom, near the heavy wooden doors, an elderly woman began to make her way toward the front. She moved very slowly. Her steps were small and careful, as if she were afraid of falling on the smooth, slippery floor. She was using a plain wooden cane to help her keep her balance. A hush fell over the lawyers and the people in the audience as they watched her. She didn't look like she belonged in this modern, high-stakes environment. She was dressed in a heavy wool coat that looked like it was made many years ago. It was a faded shade of gray, and a few loose threads hung from the buttons. Underneath, she wore a simple dress that hung loosely on her small frame. Her hair was white and thin, pulled back into a messy bun. A few stray hairs fell over her face, and she brushed them away with a trembling hand. She looked fragile, like a strong wind might blow her over. She clutched a worn old leather bag against her chest with one hand, while her other hand gripped the cane tightly as she walked down the long aisle. The sound of her cane hitting the floor echoed in the quiet room. Tap, tap, drag, tap, tap, drag. It was a slow, rhythmic sound that seemed to annoy Judge Holloway. He stopped tapping his pen and frowned, looking over his glasses at the back of the room. The lawyers for the big company smirked at each other, whispering behind their hands. They assumed she was a confused grandmother who had wandered into the wrong room. Or perhaps she was just there to watch the trial out of boredom. No one looked at her as a threat. It took her a long time to reach the front. By the time she finally arrived at the table where the people trying to save the building were sitting, Judge Holloway was clearly irritated. He sighed loudly, a sound that everyone in the room could hear. He checked his watch again and shook his head. The woman struggled to pull out a heavy wooden chair. She tried to sit down, but her coat was bulky and she moved slowly. The young lawyer, Mr. Vance, didn't offer to help her. He just stood there, looking at his phone, ignoring her struggle. Finally, with a heavy thud, she managed to sit and place her cane against the table. She reached into her old leather bag and pulled out a simple yellow legal pad and a single pen. She adjusted her glasses, which were large and thick, and looked up at the judge. Her face was full of deep wrinkles, lines that showed she had laughed and cried many times in her long life. But her eyes were different. Behind the thick glasses, her eyes were sharp and clear. She didn't look at the other lawyers. She didn't look at the people in the audience. She looked straight at Judge Holloway. The judge stared back at her, unimpressed. "Madam," he said, his voice cold and sharp, "we are in the middle of a very important legal proceeding. If you are a spectator, you must remain seated in the gallery." You cannot approach the bench unless you are counsel of record. Right. The woman didn't speak immediately. She took her time, carefully uncapping her pen. I am representing the interests of the Historical Society, Your Honor, she said. Her voice was raspy and quiet, like dry leaves blowing across the pavement. It was hard to hear her at the back of the room. Judge Holloway leaned forward, cupping his ear to mock her. Speak up, woman. We don't have all day for mumbling. The woman cleared her throat and spoke a little louder, but her tone remained calm and steady. I said, I am here to represent the defendant. I was retained late yesterday evening. This caused a ripple of shocked whispers through the courtroom. The other people at her table looked just as surprised as the judge. They were expecting a high-powered lawyer from the city, not this elderly woman who looked like she should be knitting a scarf at home. Mr. Vance, the young lawyer, laughed out loud. Your Honor, he said, turning to the judge with a grin. This is absurd. This woman is clearly not a licensed attorney. She looks like she doesn't even know what year it is. This is a delay tactic. Judge Holloway frowned even deeper. He hated delays. He looked down at the woman with complete disdain. He saw only her age and her shabby clothes. He didn't see a lawyer. He saw a burden. Mr. Vance is right, the judge snapped. Madame, this is a court of law, not a costume party. If you are not a member of the bar, I will hold you in contempt. Stand up and tell the court your qualifications, or sit down and be quiet. The room went silent. Everyone held their breath. The young lawyers for the big company looked at her with smug smiles, waiting for her to break down and admit she was lost. The people who wanted to save the building looked at her with worry, terrified that their case was about to be thrown out because of this confused old lady. Slowly, painfully, the woman pushed herself up from her chair. She gripped the table to steady herself. She straightened her back as much as she could, though her shoulders remained hunched. She looked at the judge, and for the first time, a flicker of annoyance crossed her face, but it wasn't the petty annoyance of an old woman. It was the look of a master who was being scolded by a novice. Your Honor, she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming surprisingly firm. My qualifications are not in question here. My membership in the bar has been active for longer than you have been alive. The courtroom gasped. Judge Holloway's face turned red with anger. How dare you speak to me in that tone? He shouted, slamming his hand on his desk. I have had enough of these games. You will sit down, or I will have the bailiff remove you. I will not have my courtroom disrupted by a senile old woman who thinks she can play lawyer because she watched a few television shows. Mr. Vance chuckled again, louder this time. He thought he had already won. He thought the judge was about to throw the case out entirely. The woman stood her ground, though. She didn't shake. She didn't cry. She simply looked at the judge with those sharp, steel-gray eyes. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, laminated card. She set it down on the table in front of her, but she didn't push it forward. Instead, she looked at the pile of papers Mr. Vance had just handed to the judge. I am not playing games, Your Honor, she said quietly, but her voice cut through the tension in the air like a knife. I am here to ensure that the law is followed correctly. Something it seems that you and Mr. Vance have forgotten to do. The silence that filled the room after the old woman spoke was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Judge Holloway stared at her, his face turning a dark shade of red. He could not believe what he had just heard. In his courtroom, nobody spoke to him like that. He was the one in charge, the one who held the gavel and the power. To have a woman looking as frail and confused as she did, tell him that he didn't know the law was something he refused to accept. He saw it not as a defense, but as a personal insult. He leaned forward in his big leather chair, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. You are dangerously close to spending the night in a jail cell, madam, Holloway said, his voice low and threatening. I have warned you once. I will not warn you again. Sit down and be silent, or the bailiff will remove you from this courtroom immediately. The older woman did not move. She didn't look scared. In fact, she looked almost bored, as if she were watching a child throw a tantrum in a grocery store. She simply stood there, her hands resting on the worn wooden table in front of her, her fingers tapping a slow, steady rhythm. The bailiff, a large man who stood near the judge's bench, took a step forward, his hand resting on his belt. He looked at the judge, waiting for the nod to grab the woman and drag her out. The tension in the room was so thick you could almost touch it. The people in the audience stopped breathing. They were waiting to see if the little old lady would actually be arrested. Meanwhile, Mr. Vance, the young lawyer for the big company, was enjoying the show immensely. He straightened his tie and smoothed his expensive suit, a smug smile plastered across his face. He saw this as a gift. The opposition, the people trying to save the old building, had apparently given up. They had sent in this amateur to disrupt the proceedings because they knew they couldn't win. He turned to the judge, bowing his head slightly to show respect, a sharp contrast to the woman standing defiantly. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice smooth and slippery, "I believe the defendant is confused. She clearly isn't capable of understanding the gravity of this situation. If she has no valid legal arguments to present, I suggest we move for a default judgment. We shouldn't waste the court's valuable time on this display." The judge nodded vigorously. "I agree, Mr. Vance. This is a mockery." He looked down at the woman with disgust. "This is your last chance. Do you have any legal basis for your presence here? Or are you just going to stand there and insult the court? If you cannot cite a relevant precedent, I am ending this right now." The woman finally moved. She didn't sit down. Instead, she reached into her bulky leather bag and pulled out a thick file. It wasn't neat and tidy like Mr. Vance's papers. It was bound with string, and the edges were yellowed with age. She placed it on the table and opened it slowly. The sound of the paper rustling was the only noise in the room. "I do have a basis, Your Honor," she said, her raspy voice cutting through the air. "I object to Mr. Vance's entire motion on the grounds that it violates the fundamental principles of property law established in this state over 50 years ago." Mr. Vance let out a loud, mocking laugh. "50 years ago?" he repeated, turning to the audience with a grin. "Your Honor, she is talking about ancient history. Laws change. We are in the 21st century. We are talking about progress, about building a future. We can't let old rules stop us from improving the city." "That is where you are wrong, young man," the woman said sharply. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the judge. "The law does not expire just because it becomes inconvenient for developers like your client. The law is the foundation upon which this society stands. If you knock down the foundation, the building falls." Judge Holloway slammed his hand on the desk again. Bang. The sound echoed off the walls. "I did not ask for a philosophy lesson," he roared. "I asked for a legal objection. Cite the statute or sit down." The woman took a deep breath. She adjusted her thick glasses. She didn't need to look at her notes. She seemed to have every word memorized. "Very well, Your Honor," she said. "I am citing the precedent set in Henderson v. the City. Specifically, the ruling on page 42 of the transcript, which states that a historical landmark cannot be repurposed for commercial use without a unanimous vote from the Historical Society, a vote which has never taken place." The courtroom went quiet. Mr. Vance stopped smiling. He blinked rapidly, trying to remember the case name. It sounded familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. He flipped frantically through his own papers, searching for a counterargument. Judge Holloway hesitated. The name Henderson rang a bell, but he couldn't recall the exact details. He prided himself on knowing the law, but there were thousands of cases in the books. Henderson. Okay. Holloway muttered, rubbing his chin. "I believe that case was overturned years ago. Or perhaps it was a federal matter. It has no standing here. Overruled," he said it quickly, hoping to shut her down. He didn't want to look stupid by admitting he didn't remember the details. He just wanted her gone so he could finish his lunch break. He waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "Please sit down. You are wasting our time." The woman did not sit. A small, sad smile touched her lips. It was the kind of smile a teacher gives a student who has just given the wrong answer with great confidence. "It was not overturned, Your Honor," she said softly, "and it was not federal. It was a state Supreme Court ruling. It is the law of the land in this courtroom right now." "You're questioning my ruling?" Holloway shouted, standing up now. He was losing his temper completely. The veins in his neck were bulging. "I said it is overruled. I am the judge here, not you. You are nothing but an old woman with a library card. You have no idea what you are talking about." Mr. Vance saw his chance. He stepped in to finish her off. "Your Honor, she is clearly confused. Even if Henderson was a valid case, which it isn't, it doesn't apply here. We are talking about a parking structure, not a commercial building. The zoning laws changed last year. Surely she isn't aware of the new ordinances passed by the city council." He laughed again, looking around the room for support. "New laws, old lady? Things change while you're sitting at home knitting." The woman turned her head slowly to look at Mr. Vance. For the first time, her eyes flashed with anger. It wasn't a hot, explosive anger. It was a cold, hard fury that made him take a step back. "I am aware of the new ordinances, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that everyone could still hear. "I am also aware that the ordinance you are citing, Section 4B, contains a clause that directly contradicts the state constitution regarding eminent domain. That clause renders the entire ordinance void." She paused for effect, letting the words sink in. "And I know this," she continued, "because I was the one who pointed out that contradiction to the city council when they drafted it. I told them it wouldn't hold up in court. It seems they didn't listen to me then, just as you are not listening to me now." The smirk vanished from Mr. Vance's face. He froze. He looked at the woman, really looked at her, perhaps noticing the intelligence in her eyes for the first time. He looked back at his papers, his hands shaking slightly. He quickly scanned the new ordinance he had relied on for his entire case. He hadn't read the footnotes. He hadn't checked the history. He had just assumed it was correct because it was new. Judge Holloway, however, was too far gone in his arrogance to listen. He wasn't thinking about the law anymore. He was thinking about his authority. He felt insulted that this woman was debating with him. He felt like she was trying to make him look foolish in front of the rich and important people in the room. "That is enough," Holloway bellowed. "I have heard enough nonsense. Bailiff, remove this woman from my courtroom. If she cannot show respect to the court, she can spend the afternoon in a holding cell until she cools off." The bailiff marched forward, grabbing the woman by the arm. "Come on, ma'am," he said roughly. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The woman didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She just looked at the judge with pity. It was a look that said, "You have no idea what mistake you are making," as the bailiff pulled her toward the exit. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. She didn't hand it to him. She just held it up in the air. "You are ruling on a case you do not understand, Your Honor," she said loudly as she was dragged away. "And you are bullying a lawyer who could teach you more about the law in 5 minutes than you have learned in your entire career." The door to the courtroom swung open, and the elderly woman disappeared into the hallway. The heavy wooden door closed with a loud boom, leaving the room in stunned silence. Judge Holloway stood there for a moment, breathing hard, trying to calm himself down. He looked around the room, expecting to see approval on the faces of the lawyers in the audience. But instead, he saw confusion. He saw fear. Mr. Vance had turned pale. He was frantically typing into his phone, his eyes wide with panic. He pulled up a search engine and typed in the name of the case she had mentioned, Henderson v. the city. He also searched for the new ordinance and the clause she had talked about. As the results loaded on his screen, his jaw dropped. He stared at the screen in horror. The blood drained from his face until he looked as white as a sheet. He slowly looked up from his phone toward the judge, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He wanted to say something, to warn the judge. But the words were stuck in his throat. Judge Holloway sat back down in his chair, adjusting his robes. He felt a surge of satisfaction. He had shown them. He had maintained order. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "that disturbance is over. Let us proceed. Mr. Vance, I believe you were about to finish your summary. I am ready to grant your motion." But Mr. Vance didn't speak. He couldn't speak. He just stared at the judge with terrified eyes, realizing that they had just made a terrible, terrible mistake. The old woman wasn't crazy. She wasn't a confused grandmother. She had just handed them the key to destroying their entire case. They had thrown her out for it. Asterisk, the silence in the room wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the heavy, suffocating kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes something has gone terribly wrong. Judge Holloway sat on his high bench, smoothing out his black robes, feeling quite pleased with himself. He believed he had just restored order to his courtroom by removing a disruptive person. He picked up his pen, ready to give the young lawyer, Mr. Vance, exactly what he wanted. He looked down at Mr. Vance, expecting a look of gratitude and relief. Instead, he saw a ghost. Mr. Vance stood, frozen behind his table. His face, which had been confident and flushed with success just moments ago, was now pale as a sheet of paper. The expensive suit he was wearing suddenly looked too big on him, as if he were shrinking inside it. His hands were hovering over his phone, trembling slightly. He looked like a man who had just seen a car crash happen in slow motion and realized he was the one driving. "Mr. Vance?" Judge Holloway said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. He tapped his pen on the desk, an impatient, rhythmic sound. "You may proceed. The floor is yours. Finish your summary so we can rule on this matter." Mr. Vance didn't move. He was staring down at the screen of his phone, his eyes darting back and forth as if he were reading the words of a horror novel. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The people in the audience began to murmur amongst themselves. They sensed the shift in the atmosphere. They looked from the terrified lawyer to the annoyed judge, confusion written all over their faces. The bailiff, who had just returned from escorting the old woman out, stood by the door, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Looking unsure of what to do, Mr. Vance," the judge said again, this time louder and sharper. "Is there a problem? You asked for a ruling? I am ready to give it to you." Slowly, painfully, Mr. Vance looked up. He didn't look at the judge directly. His eyes were unfocused, as if he were looking through the judge. "Your Honor," he squeaked. His voice was high and thin, completely different from the booming, confident voice he had used earlier. I think I need a moment. Just a brief recess. To review my notes." The judge frowned deeply. He hated delays. He looked at the clock on the wall. "A recess?" "We are at the end of the trial, Mr. Vance. This is a simple zoning dispute. There is nothing to review. You have made your arguments, and that the disruptive party has been removed. Sit down and let me finish this." But Mr. Vance couldn't sit down. A cold sweat was breaking out on his forehead. He looked at his phone one last time, his eyes locking onto a specific paragraph of text that made his stomach churn. He had finally found the case the old woman had mentioned. Henderson v. the city. It wasn't just some minor ruling that had been forgotten. It was a landmark case, a massive decision made by the state Supreme Court 40 years ago. It was the very bedrock of property law in the entire state. And the name. Listed as the primary author of the majority opinion, the person who had written the legal arguments, that shaped that law was right there on his. Screamed, his breath hitched in his throat. He felt like the floor had just dropped out from under him. He looked toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room, the doors through which the elderly woman had just been dragged. He replayed her words in his mind. Asterisk, I was the one who pointed out that contradiction. I am aware of the new ordinances. I drafted the amicus brief. Asterisk, it suddenly hit him why she looked so familiar and why she had been so calm while he was mocking her. She wasn't a random grandmother. She was a legend. She was the person who had practically written the book on the type of law he was practicing, and he had just laughed in her face. He had just watched her get thrown out of the room like a common criminal, Your Honor, Mr. Vance said, his voice shaking so badly he could barely get the words out. I cannot proceed. Not yet. We have a situation. Judge Holloway's face turned red. He gripped the edges of his desk, his knuckles turning white. What are you talking about? What situation? The defendant has no counsel. You have one. Why are you hesitating? Just then, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open again. Bang! The sound was so loud that everyone jumped. The bailiff moved to stop whoever was entering, thinking it was another disruption. But then he stopped and stepped aside. Walking back into the room was the elderly woman. She didn't look angry. She didn't look flustered. In fact, She looked calmer than she had when she left. She moved with a surprising ease now, her cane clicking rhythmically on the floor. She held her head high, and her eyes were locked directly on the judge. The crowd parted for her as she walked down the aisle, the fear in the room replaced by a sense of awe and anticipation. Even the bailiff looked apologetic as she passed him. She walked all the way to the front, right up to Mr. Vance's table. The young lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and hide. He couldn't look her in the eye. "I believe, Your Honor," the woman said, her voice clear and strong, much stronger than before, "that I was asked to leave before I could finish my sentence. I am here to finish it." Judge Holloway stood up. He was sputtering with rage. "Bailiff," he shouted, "why is she back in here?" "I ordered her removed." The bailiff spoke up from the back, sounding nervous. "Your Honor, she showed me her identification outside, and she asked for a moment of your time. She said if you didn't grant it, the appeals court would be very interested to hear why." The judge blinked. He looked at the woman, really looking at her, perhaps seeing the determination in her posture for the first time. "Appeals court," he scoffed, though he sounded less confident than before. "For a zoning case? Don't be absurd." The woman reached into her old leather bag and pulled out a piece of paper. It wasn't crumpled or old like her other notes. This one was crisp, official-looking. She walked over to the bailiff and handed it to him. "Please hand that to the judge," she said. The bailiff walked up the steps to the bench and handed the paper to Judge Holloway. The judge snatched it out of his hand, glaring at the woman. "What is this? A complaint? Do you think filing a complaint scares me?" He unfolded the paper and looked at it. It was a bar association card, but not a regular one. It had a gold seal on it. It listed her name, Evelyn Sterling, ESQ. Underneath, it listed her admission to the bar. But that wasn't what made the judge stop breathing. Under the section for special honors and distinctions, it listed her former positions. Former Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, retired dean of the most prestigious law school in the state, the architect of the state's modern legal code. Judge Holloway felt like he had been punched in the stomach. He looked from the paper to the woman, and then to Mr. Vance, who was nodding sadly, confirming what the paper said. The room started to spin. He realized, with a sinking feeling of dread, that he had just spent the last hour insulting the most respected legal mind in the history of the state. He had threatened to throw her in jail. He had mocked her clothes and her age. The woman, Evelyn Sterling, walked up to the podium where Mr. Vance had been standing. She didn't need to sit. She placed her hands on the wood and looked up at the judge with a gaze that could cut through steel. "Your Honor," she said, her voice dripping with authority, "you are about to rule on a motion that is based on a law that does not exist. You are about to destroy a historic building because a young lawyer told you a lie. If you sign that judgment, you are not just making a mistake. You are violating the very oath you took when you put on that robe." She pointed a frail finger at him. "I taught you contract law, Arthur. I remember you. You sat in the third row. You were bright, but you were arrogant. You didn't listen then, and you aren't listening now. But you will listen to the law." Judge Holloway sat down slowly. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. The arrogance had been completely stripped away, leaving only a terrified man sitting in a big chair. He looked at the gavel in his hand, but he didn't dare lift it. The power in the room had shifted entirely. It wasn't with the judge anymore. It was standing at the podium in a faded wool coat. The courtroom felt like a tomb. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning system, which seemed suddenly very loud in the crushing silence. Judge Holloway sat frozen in his high leather chair, his hand hovering over the stack of papers he had been ready to sign just moments ago. His face, usually flushed with authority and anger, was now pale and gray. He looked down at the crisp card in his hand, the one with the gold seal, as if it were burning his fingers. He didn't look up. He couldn't. He was terrified to meet the gaze of the woman standing at the podium. Just a few minutes ago, he had seen her as a nuisance, a confused old lady who needed to be put in her place. Now, the reality of who she was washed over him like a cold wave. This was Evelyn Sterling. In the world of law, that name carried more weight than his own. It carried more weight than the governor's. She was the person who had written the rules he was supposed to enforce. She was the Iron Lady of the judicial system, a legend whose cases were studied in law schools across the country, and he had just tried to throw her out of his courtroom. Evelyn stood perfectly still at the podium. She didn't look angry anymore. The sharpness in her eyes had softened into something that looked almost like disappointment. It was the look a mother gives a child who has been caught stealing cookies, a look that was far worse than any shouting. She adjusted her glasses calmly, waiting for him to process the information. She didn't rush him. She knew that the silence was her ally. The weight of what he had done was crushing him, and she let it crush him. "Your Honor," Mr. Vance squeaked from his table. He sounded like a frightened mouse. I had no idea. If I had known she was... If I had known... Evelyn turned her head slowly to look at the young lawyer. She didn't need to speak. Her stare was enough to make him clamp his mouth shut and sit down hard in his chair. He pulled his files close to his chest, trying to make himself as small as possible. He realized that his career was hanging by a thread. Not only had he lost the case, but he had also made a deadly enemy of the most respected lawyer in the state by mocking her age and her intelligence. Judge Holloway finally cleared his throat. It was a dry, rasping sound that echoed awkwardly through the room. He tried to find his voice, tried to find the commanding tone he used so often, but it was gone. All he could manage was a weak whisper. "Ms. Sterling," he stammered. I apologize. There has been a terrible mistake. I did not recognize you." Evelyn nodded once, a small, stiff nod. "We are often blind to what is right in front of us, Arthur," she said, using his first name. Sent a fresh jolt of shock through the courtroom. "You saw an old woman in a worn coat, and you assumed she had nothing of value to offer. You assumed that because I am elderly, I am senile. You assumed that because I am not standing here in a designer suit with a briefcase full of modern technology, I am not a lawyer." She walked around the podium, moving slowly but with purpose. Until she was standing directly in front of the judge's bench, she looked up at him, not as a subordinate, but as an equal, perhaps even as a superior. "The law is not about suits, Arthur. It is not about expensive ties or fancy briefs. It is not about being loud or bullying people who cannot fight back. It is about truth. It is about justice. And it is about respecting the rights of those who cannot defend themselves." The judge gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to disappear. He felt the eyes of every person in the room on him. The people in the audience who had been laughing at her earlier were now sitting in stunned silence, their mouths open. They were witnessing a moment that would likely be talked about in legal circles for decades. The downfall of a judge's ego at the hands of the very woman he had mocked. Judge Holloway started, sweating profusely now. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "I was trying to keep order. The docket was full. You approached the bench without announcement." "I announced myself," she corrected him gently. "I told you who I was. I told you I was counsel for the defense. You chose not to hear me? You heard what you wanted to hear. You wanted me to be a nuisance so you could feel powerful. That is a dangerous trait in a judge." She reached down and opened the file she had brought with her. It was the worn, string-bound folder she had taken out earlier. She pulled out a sheet of paper and slid it across the large wooden desk toward the judge. "This is the ruling for Henderson v. the city," she said, her voice steady. "The section I mentioned earlier? It is highlighted. Read it." Judge Holloway hesitated. He felt humiliated being told what to read in his own courtroom, but he knew he had no choice. He picked up the paper. It was a photocopy of an old ruling, yellowed at the edges. He read the highlighted paragraph. It was exactly what she had said. The law clearly stated that a historical landmark could not be repurposed for commercial use without a specific, difficult-to-obtain vote. The parking lot the developer wanted to build was illegal. The motion Mr. Vance had asked for was based on a law that didn't exist. Exactly as she had predicted. He looked at the paper, then back at her. The legal trap she had mentioned earlier snapped shut in his mind. If he ruled for Mr. Vance now, he would be knowingly violating the Supreme Court ruling. His ruling would be overturned instantly, and he would be disciplined, possibly even removed from the bench for gross incompetence. But if he ruled for Evelyn, he would have to admit that he had been wrong, that the crazy old lady had been right all along. Evelyn watched him struggle. She knew the position he was in. She had been in his shoes many times years ago. She knew the sting of public embarrassment. "The law is the law, Arthur," she said softly. "It doesn't matter who is sitting on the bench. It doesn't matter who is standing at the podium. The truth remains the same. You can rule based on your ego, or you can rule based on the law. I suggest you choose the latter." Judge Holloway looked down at the gavel in front of him. It felt incredibly heavy. He thought about his career. He thought about the respect he used to have. He realized that in the span of 10 minutes he had destroyed it himself, but he also realized that she was giving him a way out. She wasn't demanding he be fired. She wasn't screaming at him. She was simply asking him to do his job. He took a deep, shaky breath. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at Mr. Vance, who looked back at him with pleading eyes, silently begging him not to throw him under the bus. But the judge knew he couldn't help the young lawyer anymore. He had to save himself, and he had to serve justice. "Mr. Vance," Judge Holloway said, his voice shaky but gaining a little strength, "the objection is sustained." The room gasped. A collective exhale swept through the audience like wind through trees. It's the case of Henderson v. The city, the judge continued, reading from the paper Evelyn had given him, sets a clear precedent that cannot be ignored. The motion to build the commercial structure on this historic site is denied. The injunction is granted. He slammed the gavel down. Bang. It wasn't a loud, confident bang like before. It was a dull, final thud. Mr. Vance let out a small groan and buried his face in his hands. He had lost. The big company had lost. The little old woman in the wool coat had won. Judge Holloway set the gavel down slowly. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and awe. "The court thanks you for your clarification, Miss Sterling," he said quietly. I offer my sincerest apologies for my behavior earlier. It was inexcusable." Evelyn gathered her papers slowly. She didn't smile in victory. She didn't gloat. She looked tired. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving her shoulders slumped slightly. She looked at the judge one last time. "We are all human, Arthur," she said. "We all make mistakes. The measure of a man is not whether he falls, but whether he gets up and corrects his path. You corrected yours today. Remember that feeling the next time an old woman walks into your court?" She picked up her bag and her cane. She turned away from the bench and began the slow walk back down the aisle. This time, nobody in the courtroom spoke. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Every single person, the lawyers, the audience members, the court reporter, and even the bailiff stood up as she passed. It was a spontaneous act of respect. The heavy wooden doors were opened for her by the same bailiff who had dragged her out just a short while earlier. He held the door and bowed his head slightly as she walked through. As the doors closed behind her, the silence remained in the room, but the fear was gone. It was replaced by a sense of humility. Judge Holloway sat alone on the bench, looking at the empty doorway. He knew he would never judge a book by its cover again. He touched the gold-sealed card one last time before placing it carefully in his desk drawer. Right next to his gavel, a permanent reminder of the day the law walked in and taught him a lesson. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom clicked shut, sealing the silence inside. For a long moment, nobody moved. It felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving behind a vacuum that was heavy with humility. The people in the audience remained standing, their eyes fixed on the space where the elderly woman had just disappeared. They were still processing the shock of what they had witnessed. The power dynamic in the room had completely flipped in the span of a few minutes. The arrogant young lawyer was defeated, and the confused old woman had walked out as the undisputed champion. Slowly, the spell began to break. A young woman in the front row lowered her gaze and sat down, followed by the man next to her. Soon, the entire audience was seated, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The whispering was gone. The smug smiles were wiped from the faces of the developers and the businessmen who had been so confident earlier. They looked at each other nervously, realizing that the easy victory they had expected had turned into a public relations nightmare. They had just bullied a living legend on live record, and the cameras in the back of the room had captured every second of it. Judge Holloway sat alone on the bench, feeling smaller than he had in years. He stared at the empty doorway, his hands resting limply on the desk in front of him. The adrenaline of the argument was fading, replaced by a sinking feeling of shame in the pit of his stomach. He looked down at the gavel in his hand. It felt heavy, not with authority, but with the weight of his own mistake. He thought about how close he had come to ruining his career. If he had actually signed that paper, if he had thrown her into a cell, the news would have spread like wildfire. A judge arresting Evelyn Sterling for knowing the law too well. It would have been a scandal that would have forced him to resign in disgrace. He took a deep, shaky breath and tried to compose himself. He was still the judge, and the court was still in session, even if his ego had been thoroughly bruised. He looked over at Mr. Vance. The young lawyer was slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the table. His expensive tie was loosened, and his hair was messy from where he had run his hands through it in panic. He looked broken. "The court is adjourned for lunch," Judge Holloway said, his voice lacking the booming confidence it usually held. "We will reconvene at 1:30 to address the procedural logistics of the ruling." He stood up slowly, grabbing his robe, and walked through the private door behind his bench. Eager to escape the prying eyes of the crowd, he needed to be alone. He needed to think. Inside his private chambers, the judge slumped into a comfortable leather armchair. The room was quiet, filled with books and law journals, symbols of a lifetime of study. He poured himself a glass of water with a trembling hand and drank it all in one gulp. He looked at his desk. There, sitting right in the center, was the photocopy Evelyn Sterling had given him. He pulled it closer and read it again, word for word. It wasn't just a legal document to him anymore. It was a testament to her brilliance. The arguments were precise, elegant, and powerful. He realized then that she hadn't just memorized the law. She understood it on a level that most lawyers never achieved. She had been a titan of the legal world, the kind of lawyer that students like him had idolized in school. And he had treated her like trash. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out his old law school yearbook from decades ago. He flipped through the pages, his heart pounding slightly, until he found the picture of the graduating class. There in the center of the front row was a younger version of Evelyn Sterling. Even in the black and white photo, her eyes were sharp and intelligent. Underneath, the caption read, *Evelyn Sterling, summa cum laude, editor of the Law Review. The judge buried his face in his hands. He remembered hearing about her when he was a student, stories about her sharp mind and her refusal to back down. He had admired her from afar, but today, face to face, he had let his prejudice blind him. He had seen an old woman and had failed to see the genius. He realized then that his arrogance had been a shield, a way to make himself feel big by making others feel small. And it had taken a woman in her 80s to shatter that shield. Back in the courtroom, the cleanup crew was beginning to sweep the floors. But the drama was far from over for Mr. Vance. He sat alone at his table, his phone buzzing incessantly in his pocket. He knew it was his boss, the developer, calling to scream at him. But he didn't answer. He couldn't. He was replaying the moment in his mind over and over. The way she had looked at him, the specific tone in her voice when she said, "I am aware of the new ordinances." He realized now that she hadn't been guessing. She hadn't been lucky. She had known exactly what he was doing because she had probably forgotten more about the law than he would ever learn. He felt like a fraud. He had relied on tricks and loud words to win cases, bullying his way through the system, assuming that nobody would stand up to him. Today, he had met someone who couldn't be bullied, and it had terrified him. It had also changed him. Looking at the spot where she had stood, he felt a strange new emotion. Respect. Not just for her, but for the law itself. He realized that being a lawyer wasn't about winning at all costs. It was about protecting the truth, something he had completely ignored. He knew he had a long way to go to fix his reputation, but for the first time in his career, he actually wanted to be better, not just richer. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was shining bright. The air was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the stuffy tension inside. Evelyn Sterling walked down the large stone steps, moving slowly but steadily. She didn't look back at the building. She didn't need to. A young man, perhaps a law student based on the books he was carrying, was rushing up the steps. He stopped when he saw her, recognizing her face from the textbooks he had read. His eyes went wide. "Miss Sterling?" he stammered, stepping aside to hold the door open for her. Is that really you?" Evelyn stopped and smiled at him. It was a genuine, warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "It is, young man," she said softly. "It is a good day for the law, isn't it?" The student nodded vigorously, his face beaming. "It is. I saw the news feed from inside. You were amazing. You taught them a lesson they'll never forget." She patted the young man on the shoulder as she passed. "We never stop learning, and we never stop teaching," she said wisely. "Even old judges can learn new tricks if they are willing to listen." She walked away down the sidewalk, her cane tapping a gentle rhythm on the pavement. To everyone else passing by, she was just an elderly lady enjoying a walk. But to the people inside that courtroom, she was a force of nature. She was a reminder that wisdom doesn't age, that dignity doesn't fade, that doing the right thing is always worth the fight. Inside, Judge Holloway returned to the bench after the break. He stood up straighter than before. He adjusted his glasses, but he didn't scowl. He looked at the next case on the docket with fresh eyes. He didn't see a number. He saw people. He saw a grandmother fighting for custody, a small business owner fighting an unfair fine. He realized that everyone who came before him had a story, and everyone deserved respect. No matter how small or frail they might seem, he picked up his gavel. But before he brought it down, he looked at the empty chair at the defense table, the one where Evelyn had sat. He nodded almost imperceptibly toward it, a silent thank you to the woman who had humbled him. "Court will come to order," he said, and this time his voice was kind. "Let us proceed with fairness and patience." And as the gavel fell, signaling the start of a new session, it wasn't a sound of tyranny. It was a sound of justice, finally restored. The legend of the day would spread far and wide, told in courtrooms and law schools for years to come. The day the little old lady in the wool coat taught the biggest lesson of all.